This is not a history lesson. This is the genesis point, the terrifying, magnificent moment when human beings stopped merely surviving and decided to build gods. We are plunging back far past Rome, far past Greece, past the pyramids, to a landscape that defied nature itself, a landscape that was simultaneously a paradise and a death trap, known only by the name Mesopotamia. Can you believe that every single thing you rely on right now, the concept of laws, the idea of a calendar, the structure of a government, even the terrifying elegance of mathematics, was invented not by divine intervention, but by a handful of terrified farmers staring at a river they couldn't control? This is the deep, dark secret of civilization. It was born out of absolute desperation. Imagine standing on the edge of the known world, facing an unknown future, holding nothing but a handful of seeds and a hope so fragile it could be swept away in a single, catastrophic flood. We are talking about the land between the rivers, the dueling titans of destiny, the Tigris and the Euphrates. These weren't gentle streams. They were temperamental, monstrous forces. For 9 months of the year, the land was a cracked, sun-scorched desert, promising only dust and starvation, a silent, deadly promise of ruin. But then, spring would hit. And when the snows melted high in the mountains of Anatolia, the rivers would swell into roaring, unstoppable walls of water, capable of erasing entire villages and resetting the landscape in a single, terrifying night. A catastrophe no one saw coming, year after year, guaranteed by the cosmic schedule. It was the ultimate contradiction. Life-giving silt that made the soil unbelievably fertile, delivered by a deadly, unpredictable messenger. No one in their right mind should have stayed. The intelligent choice was always to run, to follow the reliable rains and the safer, drier hills. But here's where the human spirit defied all logic and safety. A small, desperate group looked at the chaos and saw not a threat, but the ultimate challenge. They saw the sheer, unbelievable potential of the Black Earth, the richness that promised harvests unlike anywhere else on Earth. If only they could tame the gods of water. They had to become engineers, mathematicians, and prophets all at once, just to survive the next season. They had to build impossible structures, colossal mud brick barriers, intricate networks of irrigation channels stretching for dozens of miles, designed to capture the flood's fury and distribute its blessing precisely, perfectly, across the parched plains. This was an act of audacious, world-changing arrogance. They were telling the most powerful natural forces on Earth, no, you will obey our schedule. You will submit to our will. And the price of failure was total annihilation. The very first structures they built weren't temples or palaces. They were dams and canals. Survival demanded coordination on a scale never before imagined. No single family could dig a 30-mile channel. It required hundreds, maybe thousands, working together under a singular, unified vision enforced by the iron will of necessity. And just like that, the need to manage the water created the need to manage people. That's the exact volatile moment civilization exploded onto the scene. You need a centralized authority to oversee the massive public works. You need scribes to track the distribution of grain, labor, and precious water shares. You need laws, absolute, undeniable laws to settle inevitable disputes over water rights and property. The irrigation ditch was the terrifying mother of the written word. The desperate need for absolute flood control was the brutal father of kingship and the state. It was a pressure cooker designed to rapidly force evolution or crush existence entirely. Imagine the intensity, the sheer daily peril. Every spring was a roll of the cosmic dice. If the water came 2 feet too high, everyone starved or drowned. If it came 2 feet too low, the crops withered and everyone starved. Their entire existence was a razor's edge walk between overwhelming deluge and agonizing drought, success and utter final obliteration. Their gods weren't distant, abstract concepts. Their gods were the rivers themselves, the scorching sun, the sky that held the terrifying promise of rain. They had to appease these terrifying forces with monumental effort and staggering daily ritual, because reality was breathing down their neck. This constant, high-stakes threat of ecological collapse, this incredible intensity, didn't break them. It forged them into something entirely new. It forced them to innovate at warp speed, inventing solutions that would change the trajectory of every human being who ever lived thereafter. In less than 1,000 years, these fearful farmers, huddled in fragile reed huts along the riverbanks, would invent the wheel, the plow, the concept of zero, the 60-second minute, and the first documented epic poem in history. They would build Eridu and Uruk, colossal cities so vast and complex they dwarfed anything else on the planet for millennia. They were performing the greatest magic trick history has ever witnessed, taking unstable mud and unpredictable water and conjuring out of it the precise, detailed, undeniable blueprint for the entire future of humanity. Welcome, my friends, to the Genesis point. Welcome to the crucible where fear met ingenuity, and the catastrophic, thrilling, true story of us, the full story of Mesopotamia, begins now. The moment those terrified settlers stared down the dual threat of flood and famine, they realized one horrifying truth: solitude was death. Survival demanded an inhuman level of coordination, a system so massive, so rigid, so terrifyingly efficient that it could tame the gods themselves, the rivers. This wasn't just farming. This was military-grade civil engineering, requiring thousands of hands moving in perfect, synchronized panic. The solution was not a loose scattering of huts, but a fortress, a behemoth constructed of sun-dried mud and sheer, desperate willpower, encircled by towering defenses. They called it the city. This seismic shift, known as the Uruk expansion, was not a strategic choice. It was the only viable defense mechanism against ecological annihilation, the ultimate centralization of power necessary for survival. Imagine Uruk, 5,000 years ago, dwarfing every other settlement on the planet, a sprawling, churning, suffocating labyrinth that, against all logic, housed 40,000 to 80,000 souls, a population density unheard of anywhere else on Earth. It was the first true metropolis, a massive, terrifying experiment where every single person was a mandatory cog in the machine designed entirely to manage the water crisis and distribute the meager bounty. This was Sumer, the land that invented complexity, where the sheer administrative weight of survival crushed the individual under the necessity of the collective. The very air vibrated with the urgency of logistics, the constant threat of the river demanding flawless organization. It was here, fueled by fear of drought and the relentless need to record the flow of grain and labor, that the ultimate weapon against chaos was forged: cuneiform. Forget romantic notions of scribes documenting heroic sagas, though those would inevitably follow. The first words ever etched into the damp clay were cold, hard lists. Endless, meticulous tallies of barley rations, precise labor assignments, and mandatory canal maintenance schedules, meticulously tracked using reed styluses. The wedge-shaped script was the hard-nosed language of the administrator, the tax collector, and the engineer, designed for speed and clarity in a crisis. If you couldn't count the grain exactly, the city starved in 3 months. If you couldn't track the thousands of workers assigned to the massive dike projects, the city drowned in the next spring flood. Writing was a technology of absolute bureaucratic control, the essential firewall between structured order and the swift, terrifying descent back into the primordial mud. This invention wasn't literature, it was accountability enforced through the divine right of arithmetic. The Sumerians understood, millennia before anyone else, that information control equals life control, and that this control required specialization: the scribe, the overseer, the priest. But who held the ultimate ledger? Who had the authority to command tens of thousands of terrified farmers to dig, maintain, and fight, forcing them into a rigid social hierarchy of specialists, laborers, and overseers who could never question the ultimate mandate? The answer manifested in a vertical leap toward the heavens, the ziggurat. This massive, stepped, mud-brick mountain wasn't just a picturesque temple. It was the financial, political, and spiritual nerve center of the entire hydraulic economy. It represented the ultimate interface between man and the devastating natural forces they were desperately trying to appease and manage through sheer organization. Every crop yield, every allocation of labor, every sacred oath was processed, stored, and dictated within its shadow. The resources of the entire city-state flowed into and out of the ziggurat, making the high priest and the early kings, the ensi, or later the warrior Lugal, the most powerful figures humanity had yet conceived. They were not merely spiritual leaders. They were the chief engineers of the state, the hydraulic dictators. Their power was absolute because the god they served, be it Inanna, goddess of fertility and war, or Enlil, the terrifying god of wind and storms, controlled the only thing that truly mattered: the unpredictable, life-giving, death-dealing flow of the rivers. Obedience to the king was obedience to the survival mandate itself, a non-negotiable term of existence. Failure to obey, failure to pay the labor tax, or failure to maintain your segment of the massive canal network meant not just social ostracization, but spiritual damnation and swift physical punishment, because that specific failure could kill 50,000 people overnight. The stakes were permanently 0 or 100 in the Sumerian civilization. This rigid, effective system, forged in necessity, immediately bred internal conflict. Picture this nightmare scenario: the birth of geopolitical friction. City A, say Lagash, builds a brilliant, state-of-the-art canal system, diverting the optimal flow path. City B, located just 10 miles downstream, perhaps Umma, finds its supply critically diminished during the scorching dry season. the water level dropping daily and fatally. The lifeblood of their civilization has been literally stolen, or at least redirected into a rival's meticulously engineered ditch. What follows is not negotiation or diplomatic trade. What follows is the birth of organized state-level warfare, fought over a ditch, over a carefully constructed mud bank, over a few crucial cubic feet of water per second that means life or death. The massive, looming walls of Uruk, erected by the legendary King Gilgamesh, and in Mesopotamia, the myths often are just history written in blood and fear, were a profound declaration, 30 feet high and miles long, built not just to keep the migrating, less organized tribes out, but primarily to defend their stored grain, their precious centralized water, and their meticulously designed irrigation grids from the desperate, equally advanced neighbors just a few miles away. War in Sumeria was not for abstract glory initially. It was a pure, cold calculation of resource acquisition necessary for species survival. The first standing armies were born out of the absolute necessity to protect the water table and the crucial supply routes from fellow citizens driven mad by thirst. Life in Sumer was a devastating paradox of astonishing achievement built on a foundation of perpetual existential paranoia. Every single mathematical calculation, the invention of the sexagesimal base 60 system that gives us our minutes and seconds, every astronomical observation, every meticulously codified law, long before Hammurabi, was merely a desperate attempt to impose flawless, divine predictability on a world fundamentally built on environmental chaos. They invented the wheel, not for joyrides or comfortable transport, but primarily to move massive amounts of earth and clay faster for construction and canal maintenance. They created the 60-second minute and the 360-degree circle to better chart the heavens and divide the land for tax purposes, ensuring no resource escaped the administrative net. Everything, absolutely everything, in this cradle of civilization was a high-stakes defensive maneuver against the clock and the merciless river. The crucible was heating up, the city-states were expanding their power base, and the internal competition was brutal. The Sumerian Golden Age was defined by incredible ingenuity, perpetually shadowed by relentless, bloody territorial squabbles over the control of the hydraulic network. And lurking just beyond the city walls, watching this astonishing, fragile ecosystem of mud and genius, were ambitious figures, warriors and strategists, who realized that if you could control one city, you could control the resources of 5. And if you controlled 5, you controlled the entire system. The stage was set for the Age of Kings, and the first true, terrifying empire was about to be forged in the dust and the blood of Sumeria. The rivers had given them life, but now they demanded blood. The moment Sumer achieved its impossible stability, the mathematical precision of their canals, the terrifying efficiency of their organized labor, was the exact moment the system turned parasitic. They had built a machine of survival, and now that machine needed to feed, expanding its territory or suffocating in the dust. The early kings were not benevolent shepherds. They were warlords, desperate strategic thinkers who understood that 30,000 people could not survive unless they controlled the upstream flow, choking off their neighbors, claiming the rich silt deposits before anyone else could touch them. This was the geopolitical reality. Control the water, control the world. fail, and your city would starve. Your magnificent mud brick temples would crumble, and your people would scatter into the unforgiving desert wind. And in this furnace of competitive survival, names that would echo through history were being forged in fire and clay. Look first at Kish, the undisputed powerhouse, the original holder of the ancient, almost mystical title of the kingship, a political designation claimed to be handed down directly from the great gods themselves after the Great Flood wiped the slate clean. Kish held the historical legitimacy, the ancestral claim to absolute dominance over all Sumer. But power is a flowing river, and history never stays still. South of Kish, in the massive, thriving urban sprawl of Uruk, a new kind of power was rising, one built not just on lineage, but on myth, on colossal architecture, and on pure, unadulterated, tyrannical force. This was the city of Gilgamesh, the ultimate anti-hero king who would be remembered for millennia. Forget the epic poetry for a moment. Strip away the monsters and the journeys to the underworld. Gilgamesh, historically, was the revolutionary, terrifying warlord who openly defied the status quo, refusing to bow to the authority of Kish and its ancient claims. His city, Uruk, was an engineering marvel, protected by colossal defensive walls that were not merely stone, but an insult to every enemy who dared approach. These walls weren't built solely for defense against barbarians. They were a declaration of absolute, arrogant, self-sufficient independence, towering monuments signaling to every neighboring king, "We are the apex predator, and you cannot touch us." The struggle between Kish and Uruk was the first true, massive clash for Mesopotamian supremacy, a battle for the very soul of the twin rivers. Yet, while the behemoths wrestled for the crown, the real, grinding agony of the Sumerian age played out in the irrigated fields, in the endless, brutal conflict between the neighboring city-states of Lagash and Umma. This wasn't a fight for the lofty title of kingship. This was a war fought continuously for over 150 years over dirt and water. An unbroken saga of hatred so intense it literally defined the concept of eternal war. Generations born and dying only knowing the sword and the irrigation ditch. The core dispute? The Gadena, a ridiculously fertile strip of boundary land irrigated by a key canal system. Umma claimed the land. Lagash built massive boundary markers, religious steles designed to warn off trespassers with the most terrifying curses of the gods. When Umma's soldiers tore them down, the war was back on, immediately, savagely. The stele depicts Eonatum leading his troops into battle in a formation that would define warfare for centuries, the phalanx. Soldiers locked shoulder to shoulder, massive shields overlapping, presenting a moving, impenetrable wall of bronze and death, crushing the disorganized Umma forces underfoot, killing thousands in a single terrifying surge. This was the birth of organized military strategy designed not just to win a territory, but to utterly annihilate the enemy's physical capacity to fight back. The cost of losing? Not just death on the battlefield, but the immediate seizure of your irrigation systems, the enslavement of your remaining population, and the absolute destruction of your city's delicate economic structure. The concept of total war, where the goal is the destruction of the enemy's state infrastructure, was invented right here in the Dust Bowl between two struggling city-states fighting over a single vital ditch. To wage war on this unprecedented scale, the Sumerians needed more than just bronze axes and spears. They needed bureaucracy, terrifying, complex bureaucracy that could manage armies. Every soldier, every ration of barley, every cubic foot of water diverted from the main channel had to be accounted for, recorded, and controlled with absolute precision. This necessity elevated the function of the temple scribes from mere record keepers into the true strategic architects of the state, the men who managed the machine of empire. Cuneiform, the famous wedge-shaped writing that defined the era, was not invented primarily to write poetry or legends. It was invented to manage inventories, track debts, draft the complicated treaties that ended these endless wars, usually by forcing the loser to pay staggering, debilitating amounts of barley debt to the victor. The sheer volume of this record-keeping is staggering. Thousands upon thousands of baked clay tablets detailed the life and death struggle of the Mesopotamian economy. They were the original big data analysts, using mathematics and accounting to solidify military victory into permanent, suffocating administrative control. The age of kings, therefore, was not glorious or stable. It was a grinder, constantly producing short-lived dynasties and endless cycles of vengeance and debt. Every time Lagash crushed Umma, a new Umma leader would rise, screaming for revenge, ready to tear down the boundary markers again, keeping the entire system perfectly designed for self-destruction. What was desperately needed was not merely a stronger warlord or a more efficient general, but a revolutionary, a man who didn't just want to win the current battle, but who wanted to end the entire game by changing the rules of civilization forever. The stage was set for a figure of mythic proportions, a man who rose from nothing, claiming no lineage to the gods of Kish or the famous walls of Uruk, but who carried only ambition and the sharp, terrifying edge of his own genius. His name was Sargon, and the sheer, unprecedented scale of the empire he was about to forge would shock the civilized world into terrified, absolute silence. The age of the independent city-state was about to end, violently, decisively, and forever. The world of Sumer had seen kings, strong men, and petty tyrants who ruled by the grace of gods they claimed to be kin to, but nothing prepared them for Sargon. He didn't just walk onto the stage of history, he exploded onto it, a political supernova that blinded the existing order and forever changed the definition of power. The legend, whispered across the dust-choked markets and the marble halls of the ziggurats, claimed his mother was a high priestess, forced by rigid social law to abandon her illegitimate son to the mercy of the terrifying river currents to save her honor and her life. He was found by a humble gardener, Aki, who raised him in the shadow of the great, crumbling city of Kish. Imagine the sheer, unbelievable audacity. This was a man defined by the soil and the river mud, not the celestial mandate of Anu. He became a cupbearer to Baba, the king of Kish, a position of intimate proximity but ultimate servitude, a phantom in the royal court, pouring wine but secretly studying the arteries of power that pulsed beneath the throne. But Sargon was not merely pouring wine, he was mapping the weaknesses, the vanities, and the fatal flaws of his master, meticulously charting the path to usurpation. The moment Kish faced a crippling threat, a crushing, humiliating defeat by the great Lugal-Ziji of Uruk, who was consolidating all of Sumer under his own rapidly expanding iron fist, Sargon saw the fissure he needed. Urzababa, the king of Kish, paralyzed by fear and sensing the dangerous fire burning in the cupbearer's eyes, decided the easiest solution was to eliminate Sargon before he became a problem. The exact details of the attempted assassination are lost to the dust of millennia, buried deep beneath the shifting sands. But the result was indisputable. Sargon moved first, violently and decisively. He seized control of Kish in a lightning coup, refusing to stop merely at the ravaged city. He knew ruling a compromised city was a trap. He needed a base entirely his own, untainted by the ghosts of old loyalties and Sumerian tradition. He marched north and founded a new capital, a place of pure, unadulterated ambition, Akkad, or Agad. The location was strategically brilliant, controlling the crucial trade routes and the flow of vital resources from the north. But the meaning of Akkad was utterly revolutionary. It was not founded on ancient religious texts or divine mandate. It was founded on military might, organization, and the terrifying promise of the future. Sargon revolutionized warfare in a way that left the entrenched Sumerian armies bewildered and utterly defenseless. He didn't rely on the slow, heavily armored phalanx and the massive, difficult-to-maintain chariots of the city-states. He utilized a professional standing army, the first in recorded history, a cadre of 5,400 men who ate at his table daily, ensuring their absolute fanatical loyalty. They were equipped with lighter axes and bows, emphasizing mobility, discipline, and speed, a devastating force against the cumbersome traditional armies of Sumer. The ensuing campaign was an absolute, shocking slaughter, a relentless tidal wave of blood and iron that crushed every resistance. Sargon struck Lugalzagisi first at Uruk, shattering his primary forces, then relentlessly pursued him across the Fertile Crescent, denying him the chance to regroup or rally his remaining allies. 50 major battles, according to the later chronicles, were fought and won by Sargon's legions with brutal efficiency and terrifying speed. Sargon's conquest was not simple dominance. It was the birth of true assimilation. He didn't just take the walls of the conquered cities, he fundamentally tore down the existing administrative system. He placed Akkadian governors and fiercely loyal military officials in charge of the Sumerian cities, enforcing loyalty through brutal, centralized control, and replacing the ancient language of administration with his Semitic tongue. This was the world's first true empire, a multi-ethnic, multilingual state held together not by voluntary agreement or shared faith, but by the sheer, crushing, terrifying force of a single man's centralized will and a revolutionary bureaucracy designed for total control. His domain stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south to the Cedar Mountains, Lebanon in the west, incorporating lands the Sumerians had only dreamed of trading with, controlling the maritime routes and the vast timber resources. The wealth flooding into Akkad was unimaginable, transforming it into the richest, most magnificent city the world had ever seen, a metropolis that instantly achieved legendary status, dwarfing even the glories of Uruk and Ur. But history has a cruel sense of irony, and Sargon had created a monster far larger than himself. He had forged the ultimate machine of empire, but now he faced the terrifying, impossible task of keeping it running, against the constant, murderous tides of internal rebellion, fueled by the resentment of the conquered Sumerians, and the external threats waiting in the mountainous shadows beyond the fertile lands. The price of this unparalleled glory was perpetual war, stretching across the next 2 centuries. Sargon's empire was not a golden age of stability. It was a pressurized furnace of ambition and blood, forged by the greatest warlord the world had ever known. When Sargon finally vanished from the earthly stage, a silence that echoed across the terrified region, the empire did not sigh in relief. It shrieked in renewed chaos. His son, Rimush, inherited a throne drenched in suspicion and revolt. The ancient Sumerian city-states, those proud centers of culture that Sargon had crushed under his heel, saw the changing of the guard not as continuity, but as the long-awaited signal to rise up. Every city, from Ur to Lagash, believed the moment of their liberation had arrived. Rimush spent his entire reign, a brutal, short decade, not expanding the empire, but ruthlessly reconquering every mile his father had already won. The clay tablets record his campaigns not as victories, but as massacres, necessary to maintain the impossible balance of the Akkadian yoke. He was a man who understood one truth. In this first true empire, weakness was death. The succession passed to Manishtushu, Rimush's brother, who immediately faced the same impossible scenario. The internal revolt was relentless, but Manishtushu turned his gaze outward, realizing that internal pressure could sometimes be relieved by external conquest. He drove vast campaigns deep into the Zagros Mountains, seizing control of vital trade routes and mineral deposits, silver, copper, and tin, the lifeblood of Mesopotamian industry. This wasn't just about conquest. It was about feeding the insatiable military machine that Sargon had created. The Akkadian army was a terrifying innovation, the first standing, professional army in history, paid, equipped, and loyal only to the king of Akkad, not to local city gods. They introduced composite bows, bronze helmets, and standardized logistics that allowed them to move faster and hit harder than any tribal militia. But running this machine required endless resources, and the centralized bureaucracy needed unprecedented levels of administrative control. Imagine the scribes of Akkad working day and night, charting the distribution of grain, calculating the tax yield from cities hundreds of miles away, all written down in the new, standardized Akkadian language, a lingua franca of domination. This was the birth of true governmental centralization, managed by thousands of terrified, quill-wielding officials. But the man who truly defined the apex of Akkadian power, and perhaps sowed the seeds of its ultimate demise, was Naram-Sin, the grandson of Sargon. Naram-Sin did not just conquer, he claimed divinity. He was the first Mesopotamian ruler to demand that he be worshipped as a living god. He added the divine determinative sign, Dingir, meaning God, before his own name, an act of unparalleled hubris and radical political theology. He literally crowned himself the king of the 4 quarters of the world, a declaration that he owned everything the sun touched. Yet, the gods, or perhaps the inevitable ecological limits of the region, demanded payment for such arrogance. The empire, stretched thin, began to fracture under the strain of its own impossible scale. The sophisticated irrigation systems, which required perfect, centralized maintenance, began to break down. The land, over-irrigated for generations to feed the burgeoning population of the imperial core, suffered from increasing salinization. The yields of barley, the staple crop, plunged dramatically, triggering catastrophic famine across the south. As the internal structure weakened, the peripheral regions saw their opportunity. And one threat, more terrifying and elemental than any previous tribal enemy, began to descend from the northeastern mountains, the Gutians. These were not city builders or organized soldiers. They were mountain nomads, described in Mesopotamian texts as a people who knew no restraint, with human instincts but dog's intelligence, a savage, unstoppable wave of destruction. Naram-Sin fought them, but the constant internal uprisings, coupled with the environmental collapse, had drained the empire's vitality. The floodgates opened. When Naram-Sin died, his son, Shar-Kali-Shari, inherited an empire already in freefall. Shar-Kali-Shari fought a desperate rearguard action, struggling to hold on to a shrinking core while the infrastructure of the surrounding lands dissolved into anarchy. The great cities of the south, once united under Akkad, declared independence, sealing themselves off behind walls, refusing to send tribute or grain. The final blow came when the Gutians, pouring into the central plains, sacked the legendary city of Akkad itself. The location of Akkad vanished from memory, a deliberate erasure by succeeding generations who saw it as a cursed monument to ambition. The empire crumbled into a dark age marked by chaos and regional warlords. The king list records the Gutian takeover with a chilling simplicity. Who was king? Who was not king? This period of utter confusion lasted for roughly a century, a deep shadow cast over the cradle of civilization. Centralized rule disappeared. Writing and monumental architecture stalled. Mesopotamia had, for the first time, tasted the bitter fruit of collapse. The Gutians, ruling haphazardly from the ruins, were seen as divine punishment, 100 years of unending locusts, tearing apart the delicate systems of the Fertile Crescent. But within that darkness, the light of resistance was already flickering. The old Sumerian spirit, though subdued for 2 centuries, was not dead. It was merely waiting for the right moment and the right leader to drive out the invaders and re-establish the glorious, but equally brutal, traditions of their ancient flood-forged culture. The stage was being set for the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance, a final, incredible burst of Sumerian power that would produce one of the most organized and totalitarian states the region had ever seen, proving that even after absolute destruction, the riverbanks demanded order. The world had broken when the Akkadian Empire, the first true multi-ethnic behemoth, finally choked on its own ambition. The resultant chaos was not just a recession, it was an ecological and political apocalypse. The mighty Sargon's heirs proved too weak, the administrative framework too brittle, and the barbarian horde known as the Gutians, the mountain venom, poured down from the Zagros, shattering every known law of physics and order in the Fertile Crescent. They were not city builders, they were destroyers, holding the land in a loose, brutal chokehold for nearly a century. A dark age where every man was a king, and every harvest was a miracle never repeated. Famine stalked the riverbanks, the canals silted up into unusable mudflats, and the grand legacy of Sumer seemed destined to fade into the dust from which it sprang. But the great river system demands order. It does not tolerate anarchy. It requires massive, unified human effort, or it consumes everything. And so, from the ashes of this Gutian interregnum, a savior, or perhaps a terrifying new master, arose. The ancient city of long a spiritual center, suddenly became the beacon of relentless reconstruction. This was the rise of Ur-Nammu, the man who would resurrect Sumerian glory in a form more organized, more centralized, and more terrifyingly efficient than even Sargon could have dreamed. He systematically drove out the Gutians, purifying the land with the sword, and then immediately turned his focus not on conquest, but on absolute, meticulous control. This was not a slow recovery. This was the instant creation of the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance, the third dynasty of Ur III, a state machine built on the singular, chilling understanding that chaos kills, and only hyper-bureaucracy ensures survival. Ur-Nammu and his successor, Shulgi, established a totalitarian state that managed resources with an almost pathological precision. The old, proud city-states like Lagash and Uruk were not allies, they were provinces, reduced to administrative districts ruled by governors, Enzi, who answered directly to the great king, Lugal, in Ur. Every single piece of land, every livestock count, every ounce of copper, every mandated labor hour was tracked. We are not talking about simple ledgers. We are talking about a surviving archive of tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets detailing transactions so minute they beggar belief. The state knew exactly how many bricks were made, who laid them, and who fed the workers who laid them. This required an educational system dedicated solely to producing thousands of highly trained scribes, the true operational backbone of the empire, who could manage this massive, centrally planned economy. The very mathematical genius of Sumer, born centuries earlier to measure water, was now weaponized to measure the productivity of every citizen. The price of stability was absolute standardization, leading to the perfection of the corvée labor system. Every able-bodied person owed time to the state, a mandatory public service building the massive infrastructure that fueled Ur III. They dredged the canals back to life, linking the entire region into a single, massive economic artery. But the most indelible statement of this renewed, divine kingship was not written on clay. It was built into the sky. Ur-Nammu commissioned the great ziggurat of Ur, a stepped mountain of baked brick, rising impossibly high, a physical manifestation of the need to elevate civilization above the reach of the destructive floodwaters. This ziggurat was functional, yes, it protected the inner shrines, but it was primarily a monument to power, designed to instill awe and absolute submission. It screamed, "The king is the agent of the gods, and his organization is the only thing standing between you and the primordial flood." To ensure this system was accepted, Ur-Nammu did something else profound. He formalized justice. He promulgated the Code of Ur-Nammu, predating the famous Code of Hammurabi by nearly 3 centuries. This was the law of the reborn land, designed to protect the weak and ensure equity and justice. Crucially, this early Sumerian legal system often relied on monetary compensation rather than brutal retribution. If you injured a man, you paid a fine, a sophisticated approach designed to keep the economic wheels turning and prevent cycles of vengeance from undermining the stability of the state. It was pragmatic law for a state obsessed with efficiency. The Ur III dynasty became a powerhouse, reigning supreme, radiating wealth and order. They controlled the flow of goods from the Gulf to the northern plains, managing trade routes and imposing their hyper-organized authority over all who lived between the rivers. The golden age of Sumer had returned, cleansed of the Gutian taint and perfected by bureaucracy. But a machine built purely on standardization is inherently brittle. It has no flexibility, no ability to adapt when external pressure becomes too great. And while Ur-3 was focused inward, perfecting its massive, intricate clockwork of administration, the wolves were gathering at the edges. To the west, the Amorites, fierce, nomadic tribes who spoke a Western Semitic dialect, were relentlessly pushing into the civilized lands, drawn by the incredible, predictable wealth of the agricultural heartland. They were not easily absorbed or managed by the centralized Ur-3 bureaucracy. Every year, the kings of Ur had to build longer walls, dispatch larger armies, and expend more resources dealing with these aggressive, decentralized desert peoples. The very stability that Ur-3 had achieved made it a massive, irresistible target. The final, fatal flaw of the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance was its over-reliance on its own perfect system. When the external pressures mounted and internal mismanagement, likely driven by decades of drought and high militarization, began to crack the foundation, the entire, massive structure would not bend, it would shatter. The stage was set for the final, definitive collapse of the Sumerian era, a catastrophic destruction that would see the great city of Ur humiliated and ultimately abandoned, ushering in a new, terrifyingly complex age dominated by the Amorites and the rise of a city known only in prophecy, Babylon. The mighty walls of Ur, once symbols of eternal kingship and the divine favor of Nana, were not merely breached, they were shattered, pulverized into dust by the relentless siege engines of the Elamite invaders, aided by the opportunistic forces of the Shamashki dynasty. This was not just a military defeat, it was the final, agonizing death rattle of the Sumerian Golden Age, the end of the line for the incredible civilization that invented everything from the wheel to written law. The lamentation priests wailed, but their gods were silent, or perhaps simply gone, abandoning the people who had built them the grandest ziggurats on earth. The sudden vacuum of central authority was instantly filled by famine, chaos, and the most terrifying threat yet, the Amorites, known to the Sumerians as the Martu, the Westerners. These were the fierce, nomadic tribesmen who had been pressing against the edges of the settled lands for generations, viewing the walled cities with a mix of awe and hungry desire. They saw the crumbling defenses of Isin and Larsa not as challenges, but as invitations. The Sumerians had built the perfect garden, and the Amorites had arrived to harvest it, not with the nuanced precision of irrigation, but with the raw, brutal force of the desert storm, an unstoppable migration that reshaped the entire demographic map of Mesopotamia. Imagine the profound cultural shock. These newcomers did not live in the meticulous, grid-patterned cities. They wandered, guided by the stars and the movement of their flocks, living in tents woven from rough camel hair, speaking a Semitic language utterly alien to the Akkadian and Sumerian tongues that had ruled the land for millennia. To the sophisticated urbanite of Isin, the Amorite was an uncivilized barbarian, lacking the refinement of literacy and the sanctity of established temples. But it was precisely this lack of attachment to the old, collapsing systems that made them so resilient, so unstoppable. They had no ancient irrigation ditches to defend, no massive ziggurats to weep over. Their loyalty was to the strongest leader, the most successful warlord, and their only goal was land. For a brief, desperate moment, two successor cities attempted to seize the fallen crown of Ur, Isin and Larsa, leading a vicious 50-year civil war known as the Isin-Larsa rivalry. This was a pointless, self-destructive fight over the corpse of Sumer, draining resources and attention, while the true enemy, the Martu, was quietly, systematically taking over the entire infrastructure from the inside out. Amorite chieftains were no longer just raiding. They were settling, becoming governors, and most terrifyingly, establishing their own independent dynasties in key strategic locations across the northern and central plains. They assimilated the bureaucracy, adopted the cuneiform script, and learned the secrets of agricultural administration, all while maintaining their fierce tribal loyalties. The assimilation was swift and deadly efficient. And among these rising Amorite dynasts, one name began to whisper across the dust-choked plains, a name attached to a small, relatively insignificant fortified town perched strategically on the Euphrates, Bab-Ilam, the Gate of God, or as we know it, the nascent power of Babylon. This city was founded by an Amorite warlord named Sumu-Abum around 1894 BCE. He was not a king of vast renown, merely a successful chieftain who understood the critical geopolitical value of the location, a perfect choke point controlling the river trade routes between the rich, salt-choked south and the emerging commercial powers of the north, like Assyria. Sumu-Abum and his immediate successors, men like Sumu-La-El, played a terrifyingly long game. They did not immediately challenge the established giants of Isin or Larsa, allowing them to exhaust themselves in their petty squabbles. Instead, the Babylonians focused intensely on consolidating their own territory, building powerful new defensive walls that dwarfed the old Sumerian ramparts, and most crucially, mastering the complex canal network in their immediate vicinity. They were learning the painful, essential lessons of Sumer's collapse. Centralization of water control equals absolute centralization of political power. Every shovel of mud dug out of a clogged canal was not just agriculture, it was a political move, securing the unwavering loyalty of thousands of desperate farmers who cared nothing for the old Sumerian gods, only for the reliable survival of their crops. Lest we forget the invisible enemy that truly destroyed the old order. The very ground beneath Mesopotamia was turning against them. The millennia of intensive irrigation, the lifeblood of civilization, had catastrophically raised the water table and brought millions of tons of dissolved salts to the surface. This insidious process, known as salinization, was turning the once fertile southern plains into toxic white deserts, rendering the ancient heartland completely unworkable for high-yield crops. Wheat yields plummeted, forcing the shift to the less valuable, hardier barley, and the great cities of the Deep South, the pride of Sumer, were slowly suffocating, strangled by their own technological success. The power naturally shifted north, to the middle reaches of the rivers, where the impact of salinization was less immediate and the Amorite grip was stronger. Babylon was geographically immune to the worst of the Deep South ecological disaster. The stage was now perfectly set for a new kind of empire. An empire born not of divine mandate and ancient sacred tradition like the fallen dynasty of Ur, but an empire forged in the crucible of ethnic conflict, ecological collapse, and ruthless military realism. The Amorites had taken the body of Sumer, now they needed the soul. And it would take a man of unimaginable ambition, cunning, and terrifying administrative ruthlessness, a man who understood law as a weapon and conquest as an art, to finally seize the entire world between the rivers and cement the legend of Babylon forever. His name was Hammurabi, the greatest builder and the most terrifying conqueror, and his rise would be the most explosive chapter in the history of the ancient world. The year is 1792 BCE, and the man who would become the legend, Hammurabi, does not inherit a stable empire. He inherits a knife edge. Babylon, glittering and vital, sits squarely in the crosshairs of every major power center left in Mesopotamia. Larsa to the south, wielding the might of a centuries-old dynasty. Eshnunna to the east, brutal and opportunistic, and the mighty kingdom of Mari to the northwest, controlling the vital Euphrates trade route like a vice grip. This was not the time for grand declarations of conquest. This was the time for silence, for meticulous planning, and for the kind of terrifying patience only a true predator possesses. Hammurabi understood that to win the war, he first had to prove he could win the peace. His first decades were not spent on the battlefield, but in the trenches of bureaucracy and engineering, forging the infrastructure that would later become the ultimate weapon. He commissioned massive canal projects, not just to feed his own people, though that was the stated goal, but to gain absolute surgical control over the water flow. Every drop of the Tigris and Euphrates became a calculated resource, ready to be diverted to flood an enemy city or cut off a rival's grain supply. Water was power, and Hammurabi was determined to hold the faucet. His primary rival was Rimsin I of Larsa, a king who had ruled for 60 years and saw Babylon as little more than an upstart city-state ripe for picking. Rimsin believed he held all the cards: the ancient religious centers, the massive agricultural base, and the unquestioned loyalty of the Sumerian south. Hammurabi knew he couldn't fight Larsa directly, not yet. He needed a shield, a friend, and most importantly, a temporary fool. That fool, or rather that temporary ally, was Zimri Lim of Mari. Zimri Lim was a man of immense charm, wealth, and diplomatic skill, controlling the crucial trade routes that stretched all the way to the Mediterranean. Hammurabi initiated a legendary diplomatic dance with Mari, exchanging lavish gifts, sharing state secrets, and forging military alliances against the aggressive Eshnunna. For nearly 30 years, the world watched the friendship bloom between Babylon and Mari, two powerful kingdoms locked in a defensive pact. But beneath the veneer of shared feasts and political collaboration, Hammurabi was meticulously cataloging Mari's strengths and, far more crucially, its weaknesses. He was learning every inch of their territory, every troop movement, every strategic choke point. He allowed the other powers, Eshnunna, Larsa, and the always menacing Elamites from the Iranian plateau, to exhaust themselves in peripheral skirmishes while Babylon grew fat, centralized, and frighteningly efficient. The population exploded, fed by the newly controlled irrigation networks. The bureaucracy became an unshakable machine, ready to execute any command, no matter how complex or ruthless. The moment of crisis arrived, not by Hammurabi's hand, but by the relentless aggression of the Elamites. They swept down from the highlands, shattering the defenses of Eshnunna and threatening to swallow the entire Diyala region. This was the defining geopolitical moment Hammurabi had been waiting for. He immediately offered his military might, aligning with the remaining coalition, including Mari and even parts of Larsa, to push the Elamite threat back. It was a brutal, existential war, but Hammurabi's troops, fresh and well-supplied, performed flawlessly. He drove the Elamites back into the mountains, liberating the captured cities, and in the process, positioning himself not as a mere king, but as the indispensable savior of Mesopotamia. The moment the Elamites were defeated, the coalition sighed in relief. They believed the danger was over. They believed peace had returned. But Hammurabi saw only opportunity. He had just mobilized the greatest military force the region had ever seen. And now, instead of demobilizing, he simply pointed it south. The long game was finally ending. His first target, the aging, vulnerable Rim-Sin I of Larsa. The attack, launched in 1763 BCE, was swift and terrifying. Hammurabi first severed Larsa's access to the vital river systems, using his centralized control over the canals to starve the land and cripple the economy before the first soldier even crossed the border. This was not a fair fight. It was an execution by logistics. City after city fell, their defenses useless against an enemy that controlled their very lifeblood. After decades of meticulous preparation, the siege of Larsa itself was swift and devastating. Rim-Sin I, the king who had reigned longer than Hammurabi had been alive, was captured and deposed. Babylon had not just won a battle, it had absorbed the entire south, seizing the ancient crown jewel cities of Uruk, and Nippur. The southern half of Mesopotamia, the birthplace of civilization, was now unified under the banner of Babylon. Hammurabi was no longer a local king, he was the master of Sumer and Akkad. But one critical obstacle remained. One powerful ally who had just helped him defeat the Elamites in Larsa, the magnificent, unsuspecting kingdom of Mari, ruled by his supposed friend, Zimri-Lim. The ultimate betrayal was about to commence, turning a shield into a sword, aimed directly at the heart of his greatest diplomatic success. The air in Babylon should have been thick with celebration. Hammurabi had just broken the back of Elamite aggression and secured the crucial agricultural heartland of Sumer, a victory that would secure his dynasty for decades. Yet, as the victory feasts raged in the great courtyards, the king of Babylon sat alone, staring at a map that glowed with a single, ominous red dot: Mari. Mari, the jewel of the Middle Euphrates, the undisputed master of the northern trade routes, ruled by his trusted friend Zimri-Lim. This was no ordinary ally. This was the kingdom that provided the vital military shield, the diplomatic counterbalance necessary for Hammurabi to even survive the southern wars. But in the ruthless calculus of empire, a powerful shield, once its purpose is served, instantly becomes a weapon that must be preemptively shattered. Zimri-Lim was still sending lavish gifts and congratulatory messages, perhaps even preparing for a joint campaign against the remnants of Ashur's influence to the north. He never suspected that the man who signed their treaties, the man whose troops he had fed and sheltered, was already drawing the siege lines in the dirt of his own magnificent throne room. The betrayal was chilling in its precision. Hammurabi did not send a declaration of war. He sent an army. While Mari's attention was fixed on potential threats coming down the Khabur River, Hammurabi's elite forces moved with terrifying speed along the Euphrates, a thunderbolt striking a kingdom bathed in false security. Mari itself was a marvel of the ancient world, a city built on the wealth generated by taxing every single ounce of copper, tin, and wood flowing from the northwest to the heart of Sumer. At its center stood the palace of Zimri-Lim, a labyrinthine monument of over 300 rooms, adorned with frescoes that still whispered the stories of a life of unparalleled luxury and sophisticated governance. This palace, now regarded by historians as one of the most vital archaeological treasures of the era, was the administrative heart of the entire region. It housed the famous archives of Mari, tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets documenting everything from trade deals and grain requisitions to detailed diplomatic correspondence between Zimri-Lim and Hammurabi himself. These tablets, preserved by the very destruction that was about to overtake them, detail the final, frantic messages. Zimri-Lim suddenly realized the game was up, sending desperate pleas to allies who were either too distant or too terrified to intervene against the colossal military engine Babylon had become. The siege of Mari was not long, but it was brutal. Hammurabi knew that leaving Mari intact, even under a puppet governor, would invite immediate revolt. The city was too proud, too rich, too accustomed to independence. The only solution was total, irreversible erasure. When the walls finally cracked under the relentless force of the Babylonian battering rams, the true horror began. Hammurabi's orders were absolute. Take all the gold, take all the grain, take all the people who could be used as slaves, and then render the city utterly unlivable. This was not just conquest. This was systemic annihilation, aimed at eliminating the very memory of a rival power center. The Babylonians didn't just plunder the great palace, they meticulously dismantled it. Every brick was systematically pulled from the walls, every foundation stone was unearthed, and the magnificent frescoes were shattered into dust. Imagine the sheer effort required for this level of destruction. It took months of dedicated military-grade demolition to ensure that not a single wall stood higher than a man's knee. The goal was to remove the city from the visible landscape, turning the grand urban center into a flat, unusable wasteland. But Hammurabi, the master of water control, had one final, devastating card to play, a weapon far worse than fire or sword in the arid landscape of Mesopotamia. He ordered his engineers to breach the great irrigation canals that fed Mari and, critically, to divert them to flood the ruined foundations of the city. The water, which had been the source of all life and wealth for Mari, now became its executioner. It seeped into the ground, turning the clay structure of the remaining ruins into a sodden, collapsed mess, ensuring that the site would be structurally unsound and utterly poisoned by perpetual dampness. By the time Hammurabi's forces marched away, Mari was not merely defeated, it was drowned and pulverized, a testament to the chilling efficiency of the new Babylonian order. Zimri-Lim, the once proud king, vanished from history, likely executed or exiled, his name swallowed by the sands of time and the mud of his destroyed capital. Hammurabi had eliminated his last great strategic peer. With Mari gone, the entire length of the Euphrates, from the mountains down to the Persian Gulf, was now under his iron fist. He had secured the north, the south, and the vital trade arteries. He had proved that his diplomacy was merely a sophisticated prelude to total war. The destruction of Mari served as the ultimate warning. It screamed across the ancient world, "Collaborate with Babylon, and you might survive. Challenge Babylon, and your entire civilization will be scraped from the face of the earth and drowned in its own lifeblood." The price of this unified empire was the obliteration of history's greatest ally. Hammurabi was now king of Sumer and Akkad, the legitimate successor to Sargon, but the crown was forged in the heat of betrayal and quenched in the waters of Mari's demise. The entire world was watching, trembling as the true shape of the Babylonian hegemon began to solidify. What could possibly challenge a king who not only defeated his enemies but made sure their ghost could never haunt him? Only one force remained, an ancient and insidious enemy dwelling within the very heart of his newly formed empire. The inherent chaos of the Mesopotamian psyche, demanding eternal, codified control. And that control would take the form of something much more terrifying than an army. It would take the form of law. The chaos that King Sargon and his successors had momentarily tamed with walls and waterworks was not defeated. It merely mutated. It became the low, constant hum of anxiety in every mud-brick home, the paralyzing fear that your neighbor's failed dike would destroy your crops, the gnawing suspicion that the temple treasurer was stealing the grain reserved for the lean, famine-haunted years. This was the inevitable consequence of centralization. When every aspect of survival depended on the coordination of hundreds of thousands of strangers across hundreds of miles of volatile floodplain, trust became the most expensive, non-renewable resource in the world. Without trust, without a guarantee that the system would hold, the entire fragile structure of civilization, the monumental temples, the complex mathematics, the very act of writing itself would shatter back into the dark, primal anarchy from which it was dragged. The answer could not be mere tradition or priestly decrees. Those could be argued away, changed by a local governor, or twisted by a clever merchant. The solution had to be absolute, immutable, and universally terrifying. The law had to be the literal, codified will of the gods, delivered by a man whose power was so transcendent that he could stand against the chaos of the cosmos and win. Enter Hammurabi. The name doesn't sound like a conqueror. It sounds like a calculation. He didn't just conquer the rival cities of Sumer and Akkad through relentless military campaigns, though he certainly did that, shattering the power bases of Isin, Larsa, and Mari one by one. His true and lasting conquest was far more profound. He conquered the very concept of local, fragmented justice. He looked at the vast, sprawling network of canals, the beating, hydraulic arteries of his newly formed empire, and understood the ultimate, horrifying truth. If the water flowed differently in one province than the next, if the debt laws in Babylon contradicted the debt laws in his empire would not merely suffer inefficiency, it would fracture along those fault lines during the next great flood. He needed a single, unbending spine for the entire civilization, carved in stone and placed where everyone could see it. A dark monument standing 8 feet high, the terrifying black basalt stela of the code. This wasn't just a list of do's and don'ts. It was a declaration that the king was the supreme surveyor, the final adjudicator of the cosmic balance, the man charged by the sun god Shamash, the god of justice, to literally establish order on earth. The Code of Hammurabi was the world's first truly comprehensive, standardized legal instrument, a weapon of societal control calibrated with chilling precision. It established the principle of lex talionis, the eye for an eye, a concept often mistaken for pure savagery, but which in the Babylonian context was revolutionary. Before Hammurabi, justice was often arbitrary, based on the whim of the local patriarch or the power of the wealthiest family. Lex talionis meant that punishment was mathematically proportional to the crime and the status of the victim, standardizing the cost of transgression across the entire empire. Consider the architect. In almost any other civilization, a poorly built house is a financial disaster. In Babylon, it was a capital offense. If your hastily erected dwelling crumbled, killing the homeowner, the law demanded the builder be put to death. Why such brutality? Because every structure was a defense mechanism against the overwhelming, liquid threat outside the walls. Poor craftsmanship wasn't a mistake. It was treason against stability, a voluntary breach in the defenses of the entire community.